Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association, section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. This episode is part of our SEER100 series, celebrating 100 years of the section.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alex Dunn. I am currently the president and CEO of CropLife America and a former EPA Assistant Administrator and Regional Administrator. But most importantly for today's podcast, I'm a former SEER Chair, 2012 to 2013. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the inaugural episode of the SEER100 podcast series. I am so excited about the guests that are joining me today for our conversation about SEER100. We're really kicking things off with a very round conversation about the section, its history, and the field of law in which we practice. And so let me welcome two tremendous scions of our field, John Cruden and Carol Dinkins. Their resumes are too long for a brief introduction, so I really am going to be brief. John currently is a principal at Beveridge and Diamond. Most importantly for this podcast, he was chair of SEER from 2009 to 2010. But among his many accomplishments, he served as the 34th Assistant Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice under President Barack Obama from 2015 to 2017, after a long, distinguished career as a career member of the Department of Justice. Also served our military. So thank you, John, for your service to our country in many ways. Carol Dinkins, also very credentialed for this podcast as a SEER chair. And we all know that you don't just become SEER chair. That means years of service to SEER to get to that spot. But among her many accomplishments beyond SEER, a legendary partner at Vinson & Elkins, and the 20th U.S. Deputy Attorney General under President Ronald Reagan, as well as Assistant Attorney General of the Land and Natural Resources Division, which was the predecessor of ENRD as we know it today at DOJ. Carol's also been a state official, an aficionado of state parks, has been to every state park in the state of Texas. And so we'll get to that through our discussion. So John, Carol, welcome.
Thank you very much, Alex. For me personally, this is a great honor. Carol Dinkins has mentored me for now, half a century, and I have the highest possible regard for you as a colleague and friend. And so being with the two of you is a great honor.
And Alex, I would just point out that I am a half-century member of the section, which is half of its history. I joined in 1976.
Oh, that's pretty impressive. I know I joined as a law student member and then transitioned in. And one of the things we'll talk about today is SEER and how it contributed to our careers, but also how it will contribute to the careers of future lawyers. So maybe I'll ask each of you for just a comment about SEER being 100. Is it possible? And what's your thought about that? Carol, I'll ask you to go first.
It's hard to imagine that the section is celebrating a century, but it did start out more in the hard minerals and energy arena than it did in the environmental arena. And so the changes occurred right about half a century ago when we were just beginning to get the environmental laws, such as the Clean Air Act and NEPA, and didn't even get the Clean Water Act amendments until some years after that. The first half century, I think, was a bit different than the second half century span, but I think that it is a testament to the leadership over that century that the section has remained not just viable, but so incredibly relevant.
I agree with Carol, kind of an impressive century. By the way, that century kind of parallels the history of the Environment and Natural Resources Division that celebrated its 100th birthday a few years ago. I mean, in some ways, we went from almost nothing, very few environmental laws, to all the things that we have right now. I very often tell my law students that, the United States did not invent much law. Most of it came from Greeks and Romans and British people, except with one exception: environmental law. Without question, the United States invented it, and then they exported it. And so all the robust law we have right now is really, for many of us, in our lifetime.
Well, I know that's something that drew me to environmental law is when I finished law school in 94 and was in law school and interned at ENRD through one of my semesters when I was at Catholic Law in DC. Someone said, go into environmental law. It's a new field. It's growing. You won't have to read cases from, these ancient days. Everything will be happening right before you as you'll grow up with the law. And I think in many cases we've grown up with the field. It's grown up around us and changed.
Alex,
So,
when I
yeah.
graduated law school in 71, we really didn't have much in the way of environmental law. Again, the Clean Air Act and NEPA were brand new. And so the field really started about the time I graduated. And then at that point, we had such dirty air. We had the Cuyahoga River on fire. We had Love Canal in 78. And just so much happened in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. But by the time I got to the Justice Department, the environmental laws had gotten to the point where there could be vigorous enforcement and there could be a lot of civil activity that just had not occurred very much in the 70s.
Yeah, we talk about the transition from having very few laws to now a whole array of the world that we call environmental law, but which, by the way, is more than that. It's more like the name of the ABA section. Environmental law really encompasses what we think of as energy law and natural resources law. But we went from nothing in any of the law schools to now virtually every law school has an environmental energy program. And many of the law schools have environmental law reviews. So it has really grown in this century that we call the environmental century.
No, I agree. At Catholic, there was one class to take. Adjunct professor was Albert Beveridge of Beveridge and Diamond was my professor from your firm, John, that you're at now. And it was so impactful. And that was the only course. And then you had to sort of make it up by doing internships and working places and trying to learn it along the way. And then years later, had the privilege of working at Pace Law School as the assistant dean, where after the first year, students could take only environmental courses for their second and third years if they wanted, and then get an LLM in environmental law, and then an SJD in environmental law if they wanted. So we've come a long way. One of the areas we wanted to explore in this podcast is the impact of the evolution of the law itself. And so I think that asks us to look in three areas: case law and statutes, and then maybe the role of the states. So first, maybe statutes. Carol, you mentioned, how these statutes came on the books from sort of generalized mineral statutes, maybe resource statutes, who could go into the ground and take what, to really pollution management statutes. Can you think of a statute in your practice, which was so broad, and your enforcement work, that a statute that you saw really make a difference and was so effective, and why, maybe in its early days?
I would point to the Superfund law, which passed in the lame duck session of Congress in December of 1980. And I point to that one because it has had such an effect all over the country. And it's one that deals with past pollution And if you look at the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and RCRA, that's more forward thinking in my consideration. But when we started implementing CERCLA at the beginning of 1981, we didn't have any roadmap, and they passed that law quickly. And so it was not as detailed. I mean, it's very different, as you know, from RCRA, where what looks like regulations are put into the statute itself. And we had to deal with things like, are we going to assert as the government joint and several liability? And that was a very, very difficult discussion and decision. In fact, the first time that I had to testify before a congressional committee on CERCLA, we had not yet made that decision. And I had to file my prepared testimony and did not mention joint and several. But when I got to the hearing before Congressman Florio of New Jersey, when he was about to pounce on me about joint and several, I said, and the department is going to assert joint and several liability in these cases. And he just turned white because he had pages of questions to pepper me with. But we were at it until late the night before in the department discussing what we were going to do about joint and several. And so I point to CERCLA as having been very impactful in my experience because of where I sat at its beginning.
That's a great example. John, how about you from the early days of a statute that you saw being transformative?
The bookends of my career at Department of Justice were catastrophic oil spills. Almost the very first case that I worked on was the Exxon Valdez, where the boat ran aground to the pristine Prince William Sound. And in 1991, we had our first settlement, and that was extraordinary. It was $1 billion, and everybody thought that was nobody would ever exceed that. But I often tell my students that a lot of environmental law was born in tragedy. So out of the Exxon Valdez experience came the Oil Pollution Act. Now, fast forward many years later, in April 2010, when the Deepwater Horizon rig caught fire and managed to foul the Gulf of Mexico and all 5 Gulf states, we used the Oil Pollution Act, which was then more broad, more powerful, more capable. And the result of that, which again was born of Exxon, was the largest settlement in the history of the Department of Justice, with over $20 billion affecting all 5 Gulf states and almost all of the provinces and regions of the area, giving them not just ecological help, but also economic help. So even though it was tragic how it began, it was successful in its use years later.
I like thinking about what you both mentioned because it's this idea of big change, making really, really big change. And I had the opportunity to work on the Superfund law. And I remember when some of the companies that I worked with in a trade association were still questioning the constitutionality of retroactive liability under Superfund. And I believe brought it to the Supreme Court. And, that concept of, is any of this okay? I mean, this field of law was evolving and there was a lot of pushback, but yet we got some really big holistic results for the environment that were unprecedented. And even the concept of some of our colleagues that we know through SEER were appointed as special masters to oversee funds, billions of dollars in the disbursement of those funds to the states to handle cleanups and restoration. It was things that I don't think in the early days of SEER could have been contemplated, that kind of collaboration. So that makes me think about the Supreme Court. We could talk about federal courts and state courts, but given our time, let's focus on the Supreme Court. There's estimates that over 200 decisions have gone through the U.S. Supreme Court interpreting major federal environmental statutes since the 70s. And that's without adding in administrative type cases about EPA authority or standing. That's a lot of cases. I know we all have our favorites or the ones where we just love a quote from a particular justice. John, maybe I'll go with you here. Is there a particular U.S. Supreme Court case that tugs at your heartstrings a little bit or really means something to you in your career?
Yeah, I would say only because it gave me a lot to do when I was at Department of Justice. Obviously, the Supreme Court decision in 2007 in Massachusetts versus EPA, which opened the door on regulating climate as a pollutant, became a touchstone for several different administrations and all the various regulations that they put out implementing that landmark decision. And then eventually the so-called endangerment finding, which then I defended that in DC Court of Appeals on 2 occasions, and right now that's in play again. That's in play again under this administration. But I would say during my tenure, certainly Massachusetts versus EPA stands out, not only because it was so important, but because it did so many different things that involved the section, involved the industry, environmental groups. It without question was a landmark decision.
I'm glad you mentioned the section because I can remember part of why I went to so many SEER conferences over the years was to stay on top of developments, right? I mean, we all, with our day-to-day work, couldn't possibly read every case, but you knew you could go to a SEER conference and go to one of those breakout or plenary sessions and hear from the top lawyers that had been working on a case or a matter or a development in law. I spent almost a decade doing only clean water, but I would go to an air panel just to stay a little bit knowledgeable on clean air. And I remember sitting in on Mass v. EPA discussions. And you knew that at SEER, you would hear from the best and brightest. And then the breakouts afterwards, the hallway conversations, the networking, the business card swapping. It just was irreplaceable. Carol, how about you? Is there a Supreme Court case that holds a special place in your heart?
Well, there's quite a number of them. The division was extremely active before the Supreme Court when I was the AAG. And the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, water rights in the West, just an enormous number of cases. And so I spent a lot of time going to oral arguments, but a lot more time going to the Solicitor General's office and arguing with them about whether we were going to seek certiorari, and if so, what we were focused on. And there were some cases they did not want to take, and I really insisted. And one of them we lost in the trial court, lost in the Ninth Circuit, and won 5-4 before the Supremes, which was a very sweet victory. We had, I think, nearly a dozen cases in just one term. But the one that we particularly focused on, and I would like for John to follow up on this, was Chevron, because that was such a seminal case in the administrative law practice and has been cited so many times by other cases. But now we have further significant developments, and maybe John could address that.
You know, Carol, I used to laugh when I was at Department of Justice, and I told people, you know, how most people have screensavers, and it's like your family and kids are in your screensaver. I used to joke that we had Chevron because we knew we were going to cite it during the day sometime. Well, of course, now that it has, in the immortal words of Justice Gorsuch, there's a tombstone on Chevron. And now you can do a word search of Chevron and then replace it with the recent decision of Loper Bright, which abandons the deference previously given to the government for their decisions. So, I mean, but Chevron, we all grew up with that. And I
We
was a
sure
law
did.
professor. I taught Chevron, and now we're teaching Loper Bright. To tell you the truth, it was easier to teaching Chevron.
It sure was. It sure was. I have to reflect on recent uh, budget hearing. Administrator of the EPA, Lee Zeldin, got into quite a roundabout with a congresswoman from Connecticut about Loper Bright. And those of us that follow these issues kind of watched it in replay several times, thinking, this is quite unprecedented that you had an EPA administrator asking a member of Congress, well, he was explaining that he hadn't done something because of Loper Bright, and that, he didn't feel that he had the statutory authority to do something. It actually had to do with climate. It's a bit political for under this administration, but he was asking the congresswoman directly, are you familiar with Loper Bright? And the congresswoman is not an attorney. And she said, I'm not familiar with Loper Bright. And he says, well, you should be. It's a very important decision. And they went back and forth for quite some time and eventually moved on. But I thought, as an attorney, many of us down the hall in my office said, wow, it's been a while since a Supreme Court case has made it into, a congressional budget hearing like this. That was quite interesting. But you're right, it has changed the game, and I would agree that things were easier to understand, especially in the science issues, when the agencies had that deference around complex science issues. Carol, I'd love to transition to the states, especially given that you were a state official. I worked at the Environmental Council of States for 5 years. And, when you mentioned Superfund and Congressman Florio, I thought about the fact that New Jersey later became such a progressive state on cleanup. They came up with this idea of third-party certifiers because they were getting behind on cleanups. And so they created a really innovative program where when a site was cleaned up, instead of waiting for a state official to come and sign off on the site, which, given the ranks of state public officials, were low, you could become a third-party certifier and sign off on the site and get it moved into the brownfields program and back to productive use. And when I worked at ECOS, we spent a lot of time trying to highlight state innovations in the environment and how states were moving forward and keeping good ideas going forward. So I'd love to hear from each of you and your experiences where you saw a state leading the way, maybe in the environmental area, and how that complemented your experience with SEER. Because SEER also focused on state issues.
Oh, the states are critical. And we had a lot of interaction with the states when I was at Justice. But I have worked with states from California and Alaska over to New York and New Jersey. I have spent in my private law practice untold amounts of time with state agencies. And they're really the first line of dealing with environmental issues. And so the states are absolutely fundamentally critical. And they're much closer to the community and to the people than what you can be when you're at the federal level. You try to be attentive to the states, but it's just so critical that the public be able to approach the people who are actually conducting the regulatory programs and conducting the litigation, and especially the enforcement actions. And the state officials that I worked with, both from inside the government and in private practice, I found to be very dedicated and very much concerned about solving problems, but also very attentive to what their particular state and their constituency needed. And I found the states to be so important in my private practice, again, because they were more on the front line in so many ways than the federal people could be.
Well, you're right. And I remember when I was at ECOS, we would often say that states brought average 95% of the enforcement actions. The ones that the federal government brought typically were on the scale that you and John have referenced, these very large, very complex. The states were always there, sort of in the car with the federal government, helping to solve the problem collaboratively. Cooperative federalism is what this is all about. But when it comes to the day-to-day routine enforcement, I saw it when I was in Region 1. You'd have the states out there, wetland violations, somebody's filled a couple of acres here or there. That's going to be a state issue. John, how about your thoughts on state leadership in the environment?
When I became Assistant Attorney General, I wanted to build on things that Carol Dinkins had done when she was Assistant Attorney General and felt strongly that our relationship with states was in the best interest of the United States. So I created a consular that did solely our relationships with states, and then largely out of discussions that Ken Salazar, who was in the Attorney General of Colorado, and I had, and then he became the head of the National Association of Attorney Generals. We created a joint enforcement manual so that we could benefit from each other's strength. Where that played out in spades when I was Assistant Attorney General is in the huge case involving Volkswagen, which is now universally referred to as Dieselgate, where we brought a case that affected every single state there, arguing their violations of the Clean Air Act, and we brought it as a federal case there. But two things: when we settled it for money that could only be used for improving the environment to every single state, and then when we were done, we turned it over to the states, and the state brought separate actions against Volkswagen, and that was a great partnership with real benefits to individual citizens. And by the way, some of them made real money selling their Volkswagen back to VW.
So I wanted to add one other thing. There is one area where I think that the feds really have a critical role that goes above and beyond what many of the states can do, and that's in the area of environmental crimes. And when I joined the division, we had just one lawyer who was on detail to EPA to develop an environmental crimes program. And so we created a unit in the division. And then when I was the deputy AG, we turned that unit into a section. And I think that it's much harder in a number of the states to have the kind of impact in the environmental crimes area that the feds can have. And John, you may have a thought on that.
I completely agree. And we had the benefit of the Environmental Protection Agency, as you all know, having criminal investigators. Here, Carol, I don't even know this. I added during my tenure to the responsibilities of the crime section. One of them was worker safety in a memorandum we did with OSHA. And then the second one was wildlife crime and animal cruelty. That came into the environmental crimes unit. And even now, during this administration, they are being very vigorous in that area of illegal wildlife trafficking and animal cruelty, and I'm glad to see it.
And John, that's something that I followed a lot because of having been on the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission and having the attention of the federal agencies to wildlife and to animal cruelty, I think has been very impactful. So thank you for doing that.
I think that's so significant. And you're making me reflect on a matter we had in Region 1 where one of the states had a vehicle crusher. They were sort of, taking old vehicles and crushing them, and they had a lot of violations, stormwater management of all of the oils and metals. And the state had tried to shut them down several times, and the operators of this yard pretty much were thumbing their nose at the state. And it was one where the state called the region and said, "We need the federal government to come in here." And I think that that's also where you see that partnership where the state says, "We have put our best on this, and we're not getting the result we need, and we want the federal resource." And the partnership continued, but bringing in that federal muscle resulted ultimately in the yard being closed. But they would not respect the state authority. That's not often, but you can get those actors that don't listen. Well, let's transition then to SEER. We've talked about so many impactful moments, cleanups, clean air, oil spills, radical cleanups across multiple states, illegal wildlife trafficking. And then we think about SEER as a home and a place where these discussions have occurred for 100 years, from when it was the section of mineral law to now SEER, Environment, Energy, and Resources. And in preparing for this discussion with the two of you, I thought about where I saw in my time SEER impact throughout the whole ABA and then more broadly. And I know both of you had influence throughout the larger ABA. And some sections kind of stay in their little lane, but I think SEER went through a real moment in around the 2000s to 2010s where SEER said, we're going to get bold and we're going to get a little bit louder. And I saw SEER make some real impact across the American Bar Association as a whole on things like rule of law, climate change, sustainable development, and environmental justice. And that led to the American Bar Association taking some very, very forward-leaning positions in these areas, largely due to the prompting of SEER. And SEER had to form allies with other groups and other sections and bring them on board and educate them on things that we were passionate about, and also had to temper some of our positions to fit a broader group. But it was wonderful to see SEER kind of grow up in that way. So I wonder if each of you might want to reflect on an area where you have seen SEER really impact the profession writ large through the ABA as a whole, and then maybe beyond. So, Carol, I'll turn it to you first.
Well, to follow up on what you said, Alex, during that decade, that time period, I served in the ABA House of Delegates, and I was on the Rules and Calendar Committee, and then I chaired the Rules and Calendar Committee. And so I saw very up close and very immediate the role that SEER played in trying to recruit other parts of the ABA to support, to help, to expand what SEER was trying to do. And so I didn't get down in the particulars from within the section at that point in time because I had a much different role, but I saw the efficacy of what the section was doing, and I was very proud to have seen that growth because that had not occurred in the 80s or the 90s, and it was a significant change.
John?
When I was chair of the section, I was also the Deputy Assistant Attorney General at Department of Justice. It was interesting to have those two roles, but one issue stands out in my mind even now because something that you became an expert in later, Alex, which was the Toxic Substances Control Act. The statute was widely viewed as inadequate and not a great statute. And as efforts were made to revise that, as chair, I got a former chair, Lynn Bergeson, And then we set up a task force that had NGOs on it and had environmental people and companies. And all I wanted, I didn't want legislation, I wanted principles. What kind of principles should Congress consider when they were reforming TSCA? She came up with a great, I have no pride of authorship. I didn't do it. Lynn did it. But then we took it to the House of Delegates. The House of Delegates approved our principles, and that allowed the ABA then to lobby Congress, what ultimately became the Frank Lautenberg TSCA Reform Act. But those principles, without question, I think had an impact on legislation, but it arose out of our section there, and I've always been very proud of that.
Oh, that's a great example. That really is. And I think you both are right. I mean, the section has always been in a place where the new issue of the day we were tackling. Lynn Bergeson is, I think she wrote a book for us on nanotechnology before anyone even knew what the word nanotechnology was. We had Mike Gerard on green buildings. We had uh, John Dernbach pushing the envelope on sustainable development, and then Lee DeHines on rule of law, and just some incredible leaders who were always willing to take the section to the next level. And what I loved about it is that they brought people with them. And so that I think is going to transition us to the future of our field of practice. Our field continues to grow. And as I was preparing, John, I found a keynote that you gave to the section in Miami in 2015. And you suggested that we can prepare for the future by looking to the past. And I think a lot of our conversation here has alluded to that, that we learn from our past and we prepare for the future that way. So I'd like to ask each of you to think about an environmental or energy or resource challenge that we are facing today and how we might address it. It could be a substantive area, it could be one about engagement, it could be about the current state of division in our country where I think some people think that environment is a political issue. You're either for it or against it, and that has to do with what political party you belong to, which is not something I ascribe to. But what's the challenge that bothers you and that you think the section can help with? And is there something from the past that teaches us about it? I'll let either one of you tackle that first.
The speech that you're talking about, I called Back to the Future, after the movie that Ronald Reagan cited during his State of the Union address. It was the highest grossing movie that particular year. And my point was that we could learn from the past as to what worked. Earth Day 1970 now has become the largest international event with over 100 countries participating. And that energy, somehow, we need to rebuild. We need to rebuild what got us going in the first place. I often tell my students when we talk about the Cuyahoga River burning, which led to the Clean Water Act, that was actually the second or third time that the Cuyahoga River burned. Why don't we add a Clean Water Act after the first or second one? I think the answer was the public wasn't ready. The public was not ready. And so I have now spoken to, a half dozen law schools, most recently Vanderbilt, arguing that our future is going to be not so much Congress giving us things, but it's going to be people, particularly young people, wanting things and convincing Congress. So instead of a top-down, it will be a bottom-up future where we can address things that are pressing, like food security is an extreme issue. Climate is an extraordinary issue. How we respond to now the weather events are all things that are in our future that the three of us are passing on like a baton in a race to people now younger than us. But I do believe that those challenges can be met, but they're going to be met by people coming together and being convened in places like the American Bar Association, where people can look forward. How do we do things together? How do we do things that the public endorses? How do we explain and educate all the roles that ABA SEER is so important, and I see a critical role for them in the future.
I would go back to the notion of what the section is really adept at, and that is that you have so many people who've been active for a long time who have such incredible careers, and they are seeing what's coming, like Lynn with nanotechnology. And there are just so many areas that the people in the section see coming along that those of us who don't practice the way they do would miss altogether. And that's one of the great strengths of the section is the quality of the lawyers who are active in the section. And an area that I would really like to see emphasized is more in the resources, because I'm very concerned about loss of habitat. The coastal prairies, for example, in Texas are highly endangered, but they are in a lot of this nation as well as globally, and grasslands similarly. And we have water supply crisis, and we see the potential for that getting far worse because of the data centers that are being built, and that we have to find power and water for them. And I think there are just a lot of fundamental resource issues that could really use the attention of the expertise of the people in this section.
No, I think you're right. We are surrounded by people who see and are already working on the next big thing because it's already here. I'm thinking about colleagues through ABA that were talking about data center impacts. Before I think I had really fully understood what data centers were or how much water they were using as a former water person. And here were a group of people putting on a panel at an ABA meeting on data centers a couple of years ago. The section is always ahead because people are already practicing in this area. Carbon sequestration, as you're saying, Carol, preservation, conservation. John, I like where you're going. The back to the future, learning from the past. You made me think, John, about something that I was told just last week about advocacy in Washington, which is what I do a lot of these days, is that a lot of us use an old model of advocacy. We write comments on a regulation, we follow the rules, we submit the comments, we advocate to the agency, we form allies. And the new model is about forming a movement and getting people around your movement. And then you do all of the other things that go along. And we were encouraged in the field that I work in now in agriculture to focus more on forming your movement first, that who's with you, and then start doing the tasks. But a lot of us were trained on the tasks. And so the world is changing around us and how people interact in the world. And I think a lot of our younger members of SEER, earlier career members, are going to teach us about building movements. And it doesn't mean we are not invested in the quality of the issues and the robustness, but there may be a different order in which we do things. We'll still get to the deep citations and the thoughtfulness of it all, but maybe in a different way. So I guess that's where we'll wrap up is how do we see SEER contributing to the next chapters of environmental law? The section had a conference, a centennial conference a few weeks ago in Denver, and one of the panels was called "A Few Old Chairs Set the Table." So I guess maybe that's us. We're a few old chairs setting a table. I'd like to think we're a few good-looking older chairs setting the table. But notwithstanding, how do we see the future leaders of the section impacting the future? What does the section look like in 5 years or 10 years to you?
I tell my law students that I educate that this is a good place to practice. Our field is only increasing. It's increasing in its importance. It's increasing in its breadth. We now think of the energy issues and natural resources issues as part of what we do. And what ABA does so well is they convene others. They bring in not just environmental groups, not just corporations. They bring everybody in together. And so the result out of that is more trustworthy, frankly, than hearing just one side of the equation. And so there's going to be an increased need for people who educate, who explain, and are trustworthy. And I think ABA SEER has played that role in the past, and I see the role in the future even more vital than it is today.
Well put, John. I think that the section will continue with what has been such a great strength, and that is to grow new leaders in the environmental law area and to give them opportunities to exercise that leadership and to be leaders more broadly than in the association. And I think that the convening that the section is able to do is so critical to our role in the law. And it has been very significant to me, even though I was not active in the section when I was a young lawyer. It was not until after I left the government that I became active. And I see that, though, as critical service that the section is able to do, along with the programs and the publications, because I think that those are top notch, and they are things that are not widely done. And the section has a great capacity and a great membership to support that, and it's much needed.
I think you both have captured that well. The resources that are available through the section, from the networking, the people, the contacts, and the books, the magazines, the programs, and the leadership programs, the tapping on the shoulder of the future people, the future leaders I love. I often will look at a program now and look down at the speakers and think, there are a lot of names that I don't recognize from different parts of the country. And I think, that's great. I am so glad that I see 3 or 4 names that are familiar to me and a lot of names that aren't, because that means the section is thriving and growing and that new people are getting involved. That's what a healthy section is all about. And so I know this section will be doing whatever a podcast looks like in 50 years. Who knows how it will be done, but in 50 years and 100 years, they'll be observing it as well. But I thank you both for your time and for reflecting on this incredible section that we've had the opportunity to be a part of during our careers. My friend Peter Wright, who some of you may recall, who was a leader in this section for many, many years, said in his career he had had many jobs, but only one section. And I like to tuck that away because I say the same thing. I've had many jobs, but just one section. SEER has followed me throughout my career, and I know it will till the end. So that's my wrap up. I'm going to give each of you a moment to have a wrap up statement, and we'll close the program. John?
Thank you for all of us, those listening to this podcast, for your time and attention. It has been our pleasure to talk to you about things that we care deeply about.
And I thank the leadership and you in particular, Alex, for convening us. It's such a pleasure to be with you both. And I thank you for leading us into a second century as a section. And now I'm going back into retirement.
Please go enjoy a park, get outside, and everyone stay with the section. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. New SEER100 series episodes will be released regularly through August 2027. So be sure to check back for more conversations exploring the people, ideas, and issues shaping environmental, energy, and natural resources law. To learn more about the section, visit americanbar.org/environ. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.